Alrighty, welcome to Module 2, Week 3 Impacts and some Systemic Responses. I want to first point out a point that the great Steve McCool, Emeritus Professor at University of Montana, made, that all visitors cause impacts, inevitably, even if subtly. And in fact, any change or movement in the system caused by a visitor or anyone else sends out ripples outward, oftentimes very subtly. These ripples are impacts that move out through the system. And our goal as managers is to try to maximize the positive impacts and minimize the negative impacts. That's the only way we can justify having tourism at a destination. Now, you may like to call impacts effects because impacts can be both positive and negative, but the word impact sometimes sounds negative and effect sounds more neutral. And since we're going to be working both positive and negative, feel free to cause them effects as well, or maybe even some other word. In any event, whether they're positive or negative depends in grand measure on the beholder, because the different people who are looking at the situation, they have different values and different interests, and they're going to measure the same thing potentially in very different ways, even contrarian ways, right? For example, we take this parking lot now in this national park. Now, this could be a very positive impact building this parking lot because it allows more visitors to come in. It also could be a negative thing because it allows too many visitors to come in. So even though not only do people look at the same effect differently, some people may look at it in the same way, but with different severity. For example, one person's all excited about all these cars. Another one may say, all right, it's not great having all these cars, but it's better having them in the parking lot than lined up all along the street. So the degree of benefit, positive or negative, changes depending on the viewer as well. So let's look a little bit about the nature of an impact. It might seem obvious. Somebody does something, they breathe, they walk, they scratch, and that causes an impact. But on the larger systemic scale, requires a little more examination. And a very famous examination of the nature of impacts came back in sometime around 1993 by a man named Holdren. He came up with a very famous equation called IPAT. You may have heard of IPAT, where the impact equals the population times the affluence times the technology, which is to say, if you're a park manager on a trail, then the impact on the trail is not just about the number of people walking on the trail, as carrying capacity would erroneously suggest, but also their affluence. Oftentimes, what is are they consuming a great amount? I'm not sure the trail so much is relevant example for affluence, but certainly in a larger scale of consumerism and economic impact, then people with larger affluence have a larger impact. They require more resources. And of course, the technology as well. So again, this trail is probably not a good example, but the kind of impact depends on oftentimes the kind of technology they're using as well. And we'll look at a little bit more of this in a more tourism related. And this is only useful for exterior physical impacts. Also for exterior physical impacts, this comes from a recent study on condition-based zoning. And this argues that the desired condition or impact is a combination of the technology, intensity, and the controls. The controls that are put on it administratively by the park. You can't leave those out, and divided by the condition of interest. In other words, oftentimes you'll see zoning that'll just say public use or agriculture, as if there was just one homogeneous manifestation of agriculture. But in fact, that's not the case. Just look at this photograph here. You've got a home garden, organic garden, and on the other side, industrial, contaminating agriculture, intensive agriculture. Now, they're both agriculture, but the technology that's being used in both cases is extremely different. the intensity is extremely different, and the controls or the rules that guide them are very different. For example, on the left-hand side, if that is in fact an organic vegetable garden, then the rule would be no pesticides, or at least no chemical or commercial pesticides. So when considering an activity, whether that be horse riding or dirt bike or any kind of activity in a recreation setting, it's really not fair to just outlaw it or prohibit or permit it without considering the intensity, the technology, the controls. And even though this particular equation doesn't consider the number of people, that too is an important characteristic. So I suppose we could add a P to the top here as well. And that's a really important lesson, that in managing impacts and managing visitors and tourism, we need to be a little more discerning than just say yes or no to a certain kind of impact. Well, there's another way we can look at impacts. We can look at impacts, or effects, if you will, as changes in quantities or changes in capitals. And I'll show you in a moment why that's important. We're going to look at. So for a very long time, the business world, they would talk about the bottom line. And the bottom line basically means money, right? So all value was reduced to its monetary value. So say that, you're selling some product and it generates happiness on behalf of the visitor. You don't measure happiness. You only measure how happiness affects their spending, right? So reducing happiness to monetary value. You could call this a monocapitalist system because the only capital of interest is finances. So the bottom line again is net profits before taxes. Now, even though this is still prevalent for many businesses, the only thing they're interested in is money, the notion of capitals and other kinds of capitals has been around for quite a long time. The idea of social capital is relationships and connections between people has been around since the early 1900s. Human capital was mentioned in 1928 by a Cambridge economist. That's not just number of people, but the skills and capacities that workers have. Natural capital, once again, we refer back to E.F. Schumacher in his famous book, Small is Beautiful. And there's a lot of work being done in ecological economics today about natural capital. And then in 1994, John Elkington, in the context of sustainable development, came up with this idea of the triple bottom line, which I'm sure you've all heard because it's pretty popular these days. And that means for sustainability, we can't just look at financial capital. We also need to look at social or community as well as environment, right? More of the natural capital aspect. So these three different spheres need to be taken into consideration when considering sustainability. And we might call this the very first multi-capitalist system, right? Where we're looking at beyond just one capital. Now, since that time, a lot of people have been desirous to produce yet a quadruple capital, a quadruple bottom line, and a lot of different suggestions have come up, adding the purpose, place, culture, spirituality, compassion, health and well-being. I mean, I found papers on each one of these, and I'm sure there's quite a few more. I'm not really sure how well any of these have stuck, but people keep adding. And the big problem is they're somewhat arbitrary. Everyone chooses their favorite thing. And of course, they're all important. So maybe we should just add them all and have many capitals, a really bigger multi-cap. And in fact, those exist too. There's at least one system that has 19 capitals in a multi-capitalist system. So people are starting to get the idea that there are other really important quantities that should be measured in looking at our economic activity or looking at any kind of activity. Now, we're going to use one particular or examine one particular multi-capital system called the meta-impact framework. And this particular one is composed of 10 capitals using 4 categories, or, the people, place, profit, and purpose. So it kind of uses the quadruple bottom line, but Each one of those bottom lines is then subdivided into multiple capitals. And these four quadruple of four, these, yeah, this quadruple bottom line also corresponds, by no coincidence, to the four quadrants that we looked at earlier: the interior individual experience, the interior exterior behavior, the interior collective culture, and the exterior collective experience. So in fact, we can superimpose the meta impact framework right on top of this. And here it comes. Ba-doom. Now you can see that there's 10 capitals and they're divided up into each of the quadrants. And you can see the notion of people are the top two, the individual categories. The notion of profit are both the exterior or the right-hand column. The notion of the planet are both the collective aspects, and the notion of purpose are both is the interior, individual, and collective. So then there's two capitals in the upper right, there's three capitals in the lower right, two in the lower left, and three in the upper right. And of course, you could actually add additional capitals if you wanted, if they were important to you, using this framework. Depends on what you're at. Maybe happiness is like your most important thing. So you could add a happiness capital. Although one might argue that would have to be long-term happiness, not an emotion in the moment, which comes and goes very quickly. And there are, in fact, happiness ratings, right? The happiest country in the world. I think Costa Rica ranked very high up there. Was it Nepal or something that ranked up in #1 in the Scandinavian countries? Some other people manage transparency. So transparency in terms of their government operations. So that I think would probably be a lower rate capital that goes up and goes down. And that's what different people manage, different things of importance. So let's take a look in more detail of how we might apply this to tourism. So we're going to look at negative and positive impacts or effects for each of those four kinds of impacts. For example, the deep impact, which is about people and purpose. And one of the first one is knowledge. So the influx of tourism causes a loss of traditional knowledge among community members. I'm not going to go into detail. I will give you a handout too of this table, which will actually have a few updates since then as well. But as foreigners come in, they can cause the loss of local knowledge. The positive side, community members learn about other cultures and other people, and so do the tourists. So that's a positive increase in knowledge. Psychologically, because of the tourism impacts, people become depressed and negative about the quality of life and future of their community because they see their communities going down the drain with all the tourism impacts. Or community members hold higher self-esteem when outsiders appreciate heritage that they had taken for granted. Sometimes people live with certain heritage, an old tree or a burial ground, and because they've lived with it all their life, they don't see it as outstanding and special. And when sometimes it takes an outsider to really appreciate it, using the expression, no one's a prophet in their own land. Spiritual capital. Maybe the commercialism of tourism distracts people from seeking higher meaning in their lives. They're too interested in making money, and that hurts the spiritual capital. On the positive side, a certain kind of tourism could focus on spirituality, religion, or moral issues. And that could focus attention on this area of growth, both for tourists and community members. And there are lots of tourism opportunities based on religion, morality, and spirituality. So the clear impact is people and profits. And I gave you a reading about this methodology by Sean Asbjorn Hargens, where he explains a little more the logic of the deep impact, why he calls it a clear impact, why people and profit. And he describes and gives measures of or indicators for each of these different. So I'm obviously going over very quickly, just showing you how they potentially could work in tourism, both positively and negatively, an increase or a decrease in any one of these capitals. Health, of course. So tourism can bring pollution and modern dietary habits, junk food. And the local people could start eating that as well, and that could hurt their health. Or tourism can increase the standard of living and availability of a wider variety of foods. You've heard of, what do they call them? Dietary deserts, like in the middle of urban cities, because there's almost no supermarkets. Well, sometimes bringing in tourism can increase the offer of supermarkets and thus increase the amount of the kinds of food and perhaps even healthier food than certain groups may have had previously. Human capital. In a highly touristic destinations, so many people could focus their skills and work on tourism has become overly dependent on it, vulnerable to perturbations that can disrupt the industry. And this is a certain concerning. A community become overly dependent on tourism and lose some of the diversity of skills that it may have had previously, or skills that were more adapted for survival and for subsistence. On the other hand, tourism can provide a new set of skills and also help retain youth who might otherwise have emigrated from rural destinations to urban areas looking for jobs. And that's a really important benefit of tourism, is keeping local people in rural areas. So just to continue down the list here, the high impact, profit and people, manufactured capital. Tourism can, when high numbers of tourists arrive, damage infrastructure, such as trails and roads, when not properly managed or financed, often to the detriment of local residents. On the flip side, tourism can involve increases in manufactured capital available both to tourists and also residents in destinations, such as new and better roads, hospitals, supermarkets, etc. This is one that's commonly cited as an important justification for tourism and community development. Next, we have financial capital. Tourism can raise land prices, causing local farmers to sell out and then actually be worse off than before due to the lack of land ownership. Here in Costa Rica, prices of land and other products have certainly increased because of the importance of tourism here, making Costa Rica the most expensive country in Central America to live. So on the positive side, tourism involves an influx of foreign income to a destination available for a wide variety of potential investments. Tourism brings a lot of dollars into the Costa Rican economy, which is good for a lot of purposes. Natural capital. As we mentioned earlier, tourism can often destroy the very natural capital upon which it is needed to be sustained. And this is one of the most common issues talking about tourism, especially ecotourism, that if we destroy or scare away the birds or destroy the habitat that we need to attract tourists, we're not going to have any more tourists. Tourism can also incentivize the protection of natural capital, such as through protected areas, research, and better management. And indeed, again, in this country and in many other countries, there's a whole vibrant sector of private conservation, private reserves. And a lot of them exist because of ecotourism or nature-based tourism. And they ultimately help to increase the forest cover in the country. The wide impacts, planet and purpose. Health. So tourism favors some stakeholders and disadvantages others, and thus can break up community coherence. And I think this is supposed to say social, not health. I might have made a mistake there. But again, in the handout, I'll make sure it'll be correct. Tourism favors some stakeholders and disadvantages others that can break up community coherence, resulting in a loss of culture, meaning making, and other shared values. On the positive side, tourism can often provide an incentive to rescue and preserve cultural, maybe this is cultural heritage, sounds like it, that would otherwise disappear in the face of modern homogenizing pressures and the need to find work outside community. And I'll give you an example and a little later in this presentation of the Embara and how tourism helped them recover their culture that they were losing, at least part of it. So human, advent of tourism can reorder relationships. Yeah, I don't think it was human either. That's to be the social. My apologies for messing that up. Very easy to fix, though. Advent of tourism can reorder relations and connections in a community, as well as cause an influx of workers, such as to work in hotels. This reordering can degrade systems of trust and cooperation that existed previously. Yes, this is the social capital one. Tourism can raise the social capital, especially of the tourism community within a destination, promoting solidarity collaboration and trust among certain groups. So you can see with certain parts of the community, social capital can be increased or decreased, depending on their role in the economy. So now I'm going to just share some different examples of different kinds of impacts or effects. I'm not going to focus on all the 10 capitals or the 4 quadrants. I'm only going to focus on the left-hand column, which is interior, and the right-hand column, which is exterior. The important idea to remember that many effects and impacts are both interior and exterior to us. So this one is pretty clearly exterior. You can see here, this is in a site in India. These people, for some reason, are destroying very important heritage, pushing them over and knocking them down. Now, oftentimes this is called, in the industry, depreciative behavior, right? These are active that, as opposed to appreciative, they're causing damage. Certainly people carving their names or doing graffiti on historic walls and sites or even in trees would also be other examples of depreciative behavior, exterior impacts, damage to heritage. Just move on here. Other kinds of damage, and this would be on natural heritage, if you will, and animals. These are guanacos in Argentina being hit by cars in a national park. Not necessarily it's intentional damage, but it is real damage, and that needs to be managed. You can also, and in addition to heritage damage, we have examples of facilities damage. Both of these pictures come from Tayrona National Park in Colombia. I think it's pretty obvious on the right-hand side what happened to that poor sign, heavy dose of permanent makeup. And on the left-hand side, a trail that has been overly used and turned into a mud pit. Certainly trail erosion, breaking items and exhibits, which is another common, trash, different kinds of vandalism are all examples of damage to facilities, visitor use or not, for any kind of park facilities or a museum. Then there are different kinds of damage to the environment here: air, water, land pollution, erosion, wildlife leaving the area because of too many people, wastes, deforestation, compaction. And this particular one in a mangrove park or wildlife refuge in Costa Rica, the boats that come in with the tourists, they create these waves, and these waves bang up against the shoreline and cause erosion. You can see this poor tree has almost no soil left underneath it anymore. In this case, there's fire set, not necessarily because of tourists, at least not directly, but fires and deforestation happen in areas oftentimes incentivized by tourists because people, or there's interaction, economic interactions between tourism and other sectors. Here we have an example of social trails. You may have heard that. This would be damage to the environment. This is where people want to get better views on the heritage, and the trails don't exist, so they make their own trails, and that can lead to erosion and things. Sometimes this is because the original trails were poorly designed. The park themselves didn't put the trails in the places the visitors wanted, so the visitors go there. Sometimes parks will take the social trails and turn them into formal trails because they see that that's actually the best place, and then appropriately manage them, put a surface down, harden them so that erosion stops. So now let's look at some interior impacts here. And this is a trailhead or a breakdown. It's a point where there's a bottleneck because people are going to go down a staircase to see a waterfall, and there's just too many people. So the visitor flow is having a problem. People are losing time. They have to wait. So this is a negative impact on their visitor experience, right? Another interesting one, and this is a double whammy. There's actually 2 impacts that we see here. This is in a park in Costa Rica. And the first impact, and actually I'm going to show you 2 pictures of the same impact. So here you see the raccoon begging for food from the tourist. And here you see the monkey's not even begging, he's just trying to grabbing the arm of a tourist. So the first impact is visitors feeding wildlife. and causing the wildlife behavior to change. So that's the first, that's an impact on the heritage. And then the heritage actually impacts the visitors, the visitor experience, by behaving poorly, if you will, begging for food and asking for food. And I'm not sure that this visitor particularly likes his arm being grabbed by a white-faced capuchin monkey or not. So this impacts the visitor experience as well. Another impact on the visitor experience is when other visitors have depreciative behaviors that then affect yours. For example, if you're trying to follow the rules and you know one of the rules is no drones, and you run into this guy using a drone inside a national park, that can be upsetting for certain kinds of visitors. So let's hope these two women in the front, they're upset looking at him using a drone inside a park where it is prohibited. All right, now let's look at some other kinds of negative interior impacts. As I mentioned earlier, tourism can drive up prices for land, food, and services. This can directly damage communities. Can damage a whole country, but certainly local communities whose tenancy and land ownership can be severely degraded or at least changed by the existence of tourism and its effect on the local or national economy. Obviously, tourism, this is not a tourism ship, but there are cruise ships can certainly produce a lot of contamination. That sounds exterior, but really what I want to point out is economic leakage, right? So this is what happens when a community pays for the expenses or costs of having a certain kind of tourism, but most of the money doesn't stay in the community. It leaks out. This is especially prevalent when, say, for example, a visitor pays several $100s for a ride on the cruise ship, and the only money and only a tiny little bit of that actually stays in the community. And the airlines too are also another industry that suck up much of the tourists' budget and take it outside and bring it to other countries, northern countries, or to bring it to the capital, right? So local communities do not get to benefit. So yeah, this is leakage, both physical and interior and exterior. Another really important collective interior impact is how it can change the character of a place. For example, this is a town in Kansas that had important Native American heritage, and they erected obviously a statue in honor of the tribe there. And all around the statue, you have fast food things popping up. It feels like such an attack on the dignity of the heritage, the indigenous tribe that was from here, because I don't know, when maybe I should take a picture, so if you can imagine taking a step back and just seeing the statue here all surrounded by modern commercialism and chain stores. It's not good for the site's character or for the heritage itself or the community whose heritage this most directly represents. But this is an interior. It's both an exterior impact having Pizza Hut and Dairy Queen because it hurts the landscape view, but it's also the one I'm pointing out is the interior impact on the culture, the dignity, and the sense of place. Here's another one. You have lots of tourists come in, and privacy can be an issue. Privacy for both the people who live in the houses as well as the wildlife, which you can see in both cases. For local communities, oftentimes privacy is a big issue when they're being overrun by tourists. Another negative interior. This is downtown Bariloche in Argentina, which is a very famous tourist spot, especially for European style chocolate shops and things. I don't know if there's any chocolate shops in this picture, but it's very nice. And you can get on the happiness train, the Tren de Alegría, in the center. It takes you out of the center, which is just a few blocks away. And the train goes through some of the surrounding neighborhoods. And even just outside the center, there is a much lower level of economic equity. And sometimes some poor communities just outside the center. So tourism can create great economic disparities. As I mentioned in last week, there's winners and losers in tourism, typically those who invest money have a greater likelihood of earning money, and poor people usually get left out, or they just get the menial jobs, which is still sort of being left out because they have no ownership. A positive exterior impact in the finance area is visitor philanthropy. There's been quite a bit written on that. How do we design products, tourism products, to promote visitor philanthropy, right? We maybe with good experiences and interpretation win their hearts, and then people are disposed to help. But if there's no invitation, if there's no ask to help, then the visitors leave without having contributed, and they move on and get distracted by other things. Here's two different on the left. There's a donation box in a wildlife reserve in Costa Rica. And on the right, there's actually people walking through a crop circle. And this sign is showing, asking people to contribute to, I guess, an organization that somehow promotes or preserves crop circles in England. And there really is an important grammatical mistake in this sign, although I bet most visitors don't see that. In any event, if you want to look for it, you can stop the video and find out. Other positive financial exterior impacts that protected areas can have by using concessions and licensing and use fees. Now, this is Iguazu National Park in Argentina, one of the most, probably their most famous national park, although they have several. And all of the public use management they've concessioned out to a company. Now, that comes with negatives as well, but one of the positive is it's a generation of income, a continuous stream of income year after year. Ideally, the other positive benefits impacts, they should be able to control the behavior through the rules of the concession. There are negatives, of course, too, precisely about the behavior of the concessionaire. But anyway, I'm not going to get into all those. But suffice it to say, there are a number of different financing mechanisms that protected areas can use to extract financial benefit from tourism. Another exterior positive impact is sales. So this is also financial. In this case, we have a local reserve here in Costa Rica, and community members are selling jewelry made by a community cooperative to tourists. Matter of fact, these aren't just tourists. These are students from the University of Montana and Public Use Planning. I mean, my organization in Costa Rica, as is the next picture. Also students from the University of Montana. And another positive interior impact is wellness, right? Increasingly, wellness is an important goal for a new kind of tourists, especially strengthened after the pandemic. And here the students are at the wellness park in Costa Rica, and they do kind of meditation, a little bit of spiritual dancing, mud on their face. So that's another potential benefit. Another positive exterior impact is they, as I mentioned earlier, provide motivation for private conservation. This is a family-owned, for-profit refuge of some 200 hectares, and it only exists because of tourism. And they make a lot of money. They specialize in hanging bridges. You can see these. Tourists are having a great time, as one would hope. Another positive interior impact, which I alluded to earlier, would be community pride, self-esteem, protection of culture. This is the Emberá community in Chagres National Park in Panama, very close to the Panama Canal. This community is very close to Panama City. They were inside the park when it was declared, or what would then become the park. They were based on subsistence agriculture and hunting. Those things were prohibited. So the community no longer had their regular sources of income, and they were going to be forced to leave the park because they had nothing to survive on. And they had exterior help in recovering some of their traditional dance, the traditional clothes, traditional handicrafts, and turn their village into a tourist destination, a cultural heritage. It's quite famous now. You can certainly search for EMBERA, and you'll see lots of photographs of the Emberá Native Americans and how they have benefited from tourism. Should say, though, there are both two different religions. There's the Catholics and then there's evangelicals. And I think it's the Catholics who participate, the evangelicals do not. So it has created a rift in their community. So that would be a negative impact as well because of tourism. But this is certainly a positive one that they've been able to recover at least some of their culture, as you can see here. And with two very good looking tourists. This is a village in Malawi, and the benefit here would be cross-cultural learning. Certainly you could debate if necessarily the tourist is bringing the most useful kind of learning to the community, but certainly the children here do look engaged with their encounter, and one could imagine positive benefits interior to them, as well as to the tourist, certainly one would hope. And the picture in the upper left is a tourist in another village in Vietnam, where a similar kind of interaction is hopefully promoting. This is another interior collective benefit of self-development, self-esteem, self-worth. My organization promotes a community-based workshop to identify different elements of the community's heritage and how they would interpret it and use that as the basis for tourism. So the one on the top is in the oldest church in Costa Rica, the Arosi, the second oldest is still in use. The bottom one is in El Cocuy National Park in Colombia. And in both cases, the opportunity to express in a consensus building format oftentimes is the very first time these communities have to articulate in a detailed value added way their own heritage, right? So they're not just speaking cliches that the National Institute of Tourism is providing them, or some historian in the capital city is providing them. They're coming up with their own meaning, identifying and rescuing and integrating their own meanings and using that as the central reference for self-identity of the community, tourism, and other uses too. Students can use it. It can be used for different kinds of education programs, so it's not just tourism. Alrighty, so obviously that was not a comprehensive, I did not cover all of the different capitals, for example, in the meta impact. I don't think it's necessary. The important ideas here are that there are different kinds of impacts, interior and exterior, and there are different kinds of capitals that we want to try to maximize in our tourism, and not just financial, and not even just the triple bottom line, which is the old kind of fashion way of thinking about sustainability. In fact, while we may only be focused on the triple bottom line, we're still increasing people's knowledge and self-awareness and self-esteem potentially, or we or they, depending on who we are. But we're not necessarily measuring those other things because they're not on our radar, those other capitals. And we're thus not fully appreciating the value that sustainable tourism could bring, or fully appreciating the damage that tourism could bring by not measuring some of those other capitals. So even though we'll be talking quite a bit about management strategies, visitor and tourism management strategies in a later session, I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of looking at a systemic response to tourists. When there are negative impacts, how do we respond? And one way to understand that is what's called the Kuznets curve. And this has been used for environmental degradation, also have been used for community capacity and other things. But the point is, at the beginning of tourism, the emphasis is on the actual tourism and building it up and development. So development is oftentimes prioritized over equity and equality, and prioritized over the environment because people are so excited and they're just trying to establish and make money. So you can see that on the left-hand column axis, the environmental degradation is going up over time. At the same time, economic growth or income is increasing, and the environment gets worse for a while. But at a certain point, people start to realize that, okay, we need to protect the environment. We have enough resources. We can start focusing on equality and other people. And then the environment improves, or the equality improves. Now, I think there's been research to show that this is too simplistic, this curve, but what it does emphasize is the idea of negative feedbacks or balancing feedbacks. As things start to get bad, then people respond to those bad things. And that is a negative or a balancing feedback. And this book here, Silent Spring, is an example in the United States of a balancing feedback as the environmental situation in the 60s was getting worse and worse with pesticides and deforestation. This book, this very famous book that led to the creation of a lot of environmental regulation in the United States, is a good example of how a negative feedback or a balancing feedback loop can come into manifestation and try to reverse some of the damage that's been done. As a matter of fact, you can argue that all environmentalism, environmental education, environmental interpretation, sustainable, responsible tourism, these are all responses to damage that has been done previously and to try to repair them. Postmodernism in general, which we talked about in the very first issue, is a response to the damage of modernism, tries to balance the ills of modernism. So these new ideas emerge to try and to deal with that. Well, and I should also mention there are new ways of managing too. The management now is not so much on command and control, top down, science-based. That's kind of the modernist, the older way of managing protected areas. There's much more interest now in working with communities and consensus and participation and sharing power, you know, and these are different techniques. They're more postmodern ideas, and they're emerging because the old ways have produced a lot of negative impacts, exterior and interior, on communities and heritage and facilities. So as I was mentioning, environmental education, interpretation, sustainable tourism, sustainable development, all of these are feedbacks to respond to the impacts. If there weren't impacts caused by the earlier way of doing things, the earlier mentality, there would have been no need for the evolution or the emergence of environmental education interpretation. So these exist because of a perceived need. Matter of fact, this whole course exists as a response to a certain need as well. And I'm sure your interests also reflect that. I'm going to give you one case study of a different systemic response. I gave you a couple readings on the attractiveness principle. And the attractiveness principle, while there's a technical definition, it basically argues that attractive sites attract more and more people. And with more and more people comes more and more impacts, and then damage, and then that site is not attractive anymore. That could be for tourism, that could be for living, right? Early in the process, a new place is discovered. The rich and the mobile people get there first. They build their houses. They love it because their houses are surrounded by forests. But over time, that site begins to urbanize, begins to densify, prices change, the reputation change, and it's not so attractive anymore to the rich and the mobile. So they move on to the next site, while the poorer people who are less rich, obviously, and less mobile, they stay behind in a site whose value has been diminished. So if you're a tourism destination and you haven't been overrun or homogenized yet, the question is, well, what can you do to stop this cycle of diminishment? And the attractiveness principle says you have to reduce the attractiveness of your site in some way. So that'll slow down or prevent, at least slow down, your site from falling in the same cycle of behavior, where the rich come first, they enjoy the novelty, and then eventually it gets overrun. And this is similar a little bit to the Doofus and Dearden model, right? Where the experts come first, they're all surrounded by the wildlife, but over time, the novice generalists move in, so they need more resources, more impacts occur, and then those specialists have to go someplace else. So how do we slow that down or diminish it? Well, I'm going to give you an example of one case study here in Costa Rica that's quite famous. Now, Monteverde is a very famous site in Costa Rica. It's actually famous in the world. It's a cloud forest. started by the Quakers in the 1950s and 60s. I think they were escaping the Korean War, and they came to do agriculture, and the access to the community was quite difficult. But even as they started to preserve reserves and the quetzal, the beautiful bird that can be found here, and it started to become a tourist attraction. But because it was difficult, the road to get there was muddy and unpaved, lots of people couldn't make it or wouldn't make it because they didn't have the vehicles or the time or the patience to go through a road like this. So this unpaved road kept tourism numbers down. But over time, there was a much stronger and growing pressure, both from the tourism sector as well as the government, to pave it so that more tourists could come in and more development could occur. But some parts of the local community fought that. They knew that if they paved this road, if they made their site more attractive, the tourism would flood in. So they resisted for quite some while. They were basically applying the attractiveness principle, right? They were trying to make some aspect of their site less attractive to keep down the tourism numbers. And for a while it worked, because this is what happens when you don't have when you have unpaved roads, right? They can wash out much more easily, and the road gets closed down. But eventually, the greater forces of economics won out, and the government did pave the road. And now you can get there, and even though water can still run across it, the attractiveness principle no longer applies in this system. So that's something about the systemic response we've seen a little bit, and we're going to look much more specifically in particular kinds of strategies that managers can use in a later lecture. So thank you very much, and see you on the internet.